In this section, we're going to discuss how to proceed in conducting a developmental assessment for a young child in early intervention, and to consider that a developmental assessment as a process that commences from the first moment that you hear about the referral or are first introduced to the fact that you're going to conduct an assessment, and also the idea that much assessment activity occurs before you even meet the child. I have to give a little bit of a warning that in this section it is both a little dry and abstract in its style. In this section in particular, what I want to emphasize is more a thinking process, or a way that we approach in our mind the assessment process, rather than the specifics of what to do at each step, to introduce a mindset to assessment that we can then explore in greater detail in various later sections. One of the key principles of conducting developmental assessments is to appreciate that this assessment has begun in some form from the first moment that you hear about it. Where most clinicians will hear about an assessment to be conducted is typically in an intake meeting, a referral committee, or a team meeting where this child is initially being discussed, where they're being introduced to who this child is and the fact that an assessment is going to be conducted. There may or may not be much information at this point. In any case, what there will be is a request to conduct an assessment that will then be defined as being one developmental in nature. That is, that we're looking to get some information about this child to guesstimate their developmental level, or if there are any developmental delays or issues. So conducting a developmental assessment starts with attempting to understand what the purpose of the assessment actually is. And one way to think about this is to pose as a question, what is the referral for? The referral question is exploring or considering who's asking for it, who's asking for this assessment, and why have they asked it. Now, at one level this might seem very simple. For example, there might be a referral that's come in from a primary care speech and language therapist or a public health nurse that has expressed concerns about a child's development. Therefore, the referral question is, can you confirm, does this child present with developmental delays? And the assumption is that once the assessment is conducted and this is confirmed, then the early intervention service is going to be the service that provides support to this family, the most appropriate place, as opposed to a primary care setting in speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, or even primary care psychology. So the reason for the assessment, the referral question, is where is the most appropriate place that this child's needs will be met. When we get a referral, there will be very explicit reasons for this assessment. There will be stated within the referral something. And with that referral, there may well be some reports from previous clinicians who have been involved that specifically state that they have made a referral to the early intervention service. So the explicit purpose in the referral is that which is stated within the referral form or within the report. Just as importantly, what needs to be done as part of the assessment process is to ask some questions around, are there implicit or hidden reasons for this referral? Now, by hidden, I don't mean that they're being deliberately kept secret. I mean that at this moment that you have received this referral, they're not clearly in view, that there may be other purposes or reasons for which this report that's going to be written is in reality being sought. A very simple example is a principal may make a referral to a NEP psychologist to conduct a cognitive assessment of the child who is in junior infants, because they want to estimate the child's level of cognitive functioning to make decisions on how to best support the child. The implicit or hidden reason for this referral is that the principal is considering that maybe the child be best placed in a special class or a special school for children with learning disabilities. Alternatively, a referral may have been made for a diagnosis of autism to be determined. But in fact, in further exploration, what is uncovered is that the purpose for wanting this diagnosis is to access an ASD preschool or a classroom in the mainstream school. Or again, a parent may state that the reason they want the assessment is to determine if the child has got a developmental delay or a general learning disability or autism. But when time is spent with the parent, what becomes revealed is that the parent is saying, I really don't know how to manage, and I need help in ideas of how to help my child every day. So before we have even spoken to anybody, before we've had a chance to gather further information, one of the first things we should be doing is identifying what we believe the real purpose for this assessment is. In most situations, this is simply adding more detail, more description to the purpose of the referral and for the assessment. What we also need to recognize from the beginning is that there are in fact several stakeholders that can be involved. There's of course the child themselves, and there's the parent, there's the referrer, the person who has sent the referral on for assessment. If this child is in a preschool, then there is a preschool leader. If the child is in school, then there's a principal or teacher. There can also be a SENO, the Special Education Needs Organiser, and the Education Department that are all looking at this assessment with slightly different perspectives. They're wanting this report to do slightly different things. And it's not that these are always in conflict, or even often in conflict, but to recognize the fact that when we're looking at the real purpose of the assessment, we're probably attempting to address several audiences and several stakeholders at the same time. Unpacking this is critical for us to write a better report. Again, a very simplistic example is a parent may be coming in with their child who's asked for this referral through a primary care therapist. What they're saying is, I want help. I want help to know how to manage my child or help my child develop and grow to their potential. The SENO, the Special Education Needs Organiser, is looking for a classification so they can make a determination of what resources will be allocated. And there may even be a very specific agenda of maybe facilitating that child to attend a special preschool for children with autism. So in our attempts to complete a more useful assessment, it is to either mentally become aware of these or to bring that which is not yet stated out explicitly. From the very beginning, it is important to clarify in your mind who you feel is the real client. When a referral is made, you're focusing on conducting an assessment of a child to gather information about that child. But in many real ways, particularly with very young children, your real client is typically the parents. And even though the referral has come from another therapist, a public health nurse, or a GP, the people who are in fact driving this are the parents. It is they who are seeking this information. It is they who are seeking help. Typically, a 2 or 3 year old child is not thinking about any of this at all. This becomes significantly more complex when you're dealing with children who are older and have got much more awareness of the process, and with adolescents who then will have a much more expressed opinion on it. But focusing on early intervention, it's to recognize who we are in fact engaging with as this assessment. We may be conducting an assessment on a child, about a child, but in many ways, in very real ways, the client that we are working with are the parents. Goldfinger and Pomerantz suggest that what we must do is more extensive detective work to unravel or reveal all of these questions, so that what is in our mind is a more detailed, more nuanced, more enriched understanding of what we're attempting to achieve by our assessment. This doesn't necessarily mean it makes it more complex or more difficult. It makes it more focused because we're aware of the different things that we're trying to achieve. And sometimes what we need to do is rank order who are in fact our primary and who are our secondary and tertiary audiences, who we are really writing this report for, who we are really conducting this assessment, who is the primary recipient of this information, and what do they want to do with it. We may decide that this is the parents. We may decide that the purpose of this report is to answer questions for them that then guide decisions on what is the best way to support their child. We may decide that this is the primary thing we're attempting to achieve, but we're also cognizant of the fact that this will be read by a preschool and that it will be used for resources by that preschool or when the child is going into national school. But having some sort of ordering in our mind of how we are targeting who is going to receive this assessment and report is useful for the way that we think about the assessment and also writing it up. And to that end, it is important to have in our mind from the very beginning, even if we say it briefly, even if we can reduce it down to one or two simple sentences, what are the implications of this assessment? If we're conducting a developmental assessment, what are the potential outcomes from what we do? If we give a diagnosis of a developmental delay or general learning disability or intellectual disability, or if we're conducting a diagnostic assessment of autism, what will this mean? What will be the outcomes of that diagnosis? How are the people who read this report going to use it? Are there resources in play here? Is accessing a school or a special classroom or accessing equipment at stake? Will this assessment provide answers to a parent in a way that is meaningful and useful to them? Very frequently, clinicians assume that the function of a developmental assessment is a yes-no answer. Does this child have a learning disability or not? Does this child have autism or not? This yes-no answer assumption is one that is worth exploring in a little bit more detail before we consider the steps or the process by which the assessment is going to be conducted. Therefore, sometimes it is useful spending a little bit of time talking to a few people, including the person who has made the referral, the parents themselves, or the school or the preschool, to clarify their understanding of why this assessment is occurring. Another thing to be very aware of is that we may be conducting assessments on occasions where parents explicitly, or through a little bit of discussion, will reveal that they're very concerned about other people finding out about this assessment, that they're very concerned that their child will be labeled or stigmatized. Unpacking all of this and bringing it out so that it is in the forefront of everyone and that everyone has agreed upon it can be quite critical to allowing this assessment, that once it's completed and feedback is given, to be more useful. So in this way, clarifying with the people, the main stakeholders, what the goals of this assessment are and what the outcomes and the implications of doing this assessment are going to be can be well worth it. Now, in many cases, this is done quite quickly. A simple phone call with a parent prior to starting and talking about why they're wanting this assessment can nail this down and we can move on. Can also then give great clarity to the steps that should be undertaken. But in many circumstances, there's a little bit more to it, and through just some simple discussion, this can be revealed. What is important is that we then reframe it back to everybody and clarify explicitly this is why we're conducting the assessment. We might look at some examples of this in another section. One of the things that's useful to do from the very beginning, but certainly by the time we've written the report, is to then outline what are the main questions we're attempting to answer. So for example, does Kian have a developmental delay? Another question might be, what are the best ways to support him if he has a developmental delay? And what resources would be most applicable for Kian if he were to have a developmental delay? When thinking about how we're going to conduct an assessment, though it may seem in some ways extremely obvious, it is particularly useful to understand that an assessment is a process. That is, there are going to be a sequence of assessment activities that are going to be conducted over a period of time. That includes first hearing about the referral, making decisions of what tasks you're going to do and when, right through to giving feedback to parents and writing up the report. But even within one session, one day of conducting some activities, there's also a process of preparation, process of conducting, the process of ending. When even doing a session, how that session is going to progress. And understanding that from the very moment you first heard about this to the moment that you complete it, that this process involves a series of steps. And they are all contributing to completing the assessment. So from the very beginning, making some decisions, deciding actively how you're going to conduct this assessment, and even if what you have decided is you're going to do it in the same way that you've done most others, but to note that that is what you are doing is an important step. But if we have been listening carefully to the information we got at referral, and we've asked ourselves the main referral questions, and we have an understanding of the perspective of different stakeholders, and we have some basic information around the child, we should, from that beginning point, from when we're first hearing, making decisions about the process we're going to use that is best matched to this child and those stakeholders, this parents, the school, the preschool. Can I give you a very simple example? You hear at the point that you're first being given the assessment, that the purpose of this assessment, both from the parents and from the preschool, is that this child who very clearly is presenting with significant challenges and most likely does have a developmental delay and or autism, the parents are looking to get their child into a special preschool for children with autism. The function of the assessment is administrative or resource-based. Parents aren't looking for an answer. They're not looking for a whole series of interventions coming from you right now. What they're wanting is to get their child into a preschool where they feel that this child's needs are going to be best met. This should fundamentally dictate the assessment process. It is, how can we the most quickly, the most efficiently complete an assessment that allows that to be conducted and completed for that need. And if there are other needs, if there are other things being sought, this can be done subsequently. So even defining what kind of assessment you're going to conduct, what the report will look like, how quickly you'll do it, should be informed by the purpose of the assessment. So therefore, shaping your process should be well matched to what the needs are within this assessment. So again, the process truly does begin from the first moment you've heard of this assessment or got the referral. And even if what you're doing at that very early stages, before you've spoken to a parent, before you've had a chance to really read everything, is that you're simply generating hypotheses and even asking questions of your clinicians based on the information that you do have. So from the beginning and all the way through your assessment, you are in a continual hypothesis generation and testing mode. So when you first hear about the referral that's come through, maybe, for example, there's been a report from a speech and language therapist concerns about learning disability or autism, immediately you have read this report, it's been read out in the intake meeting, or is being discussed by the team. There should be ideas, there should be hypotheses that you're generating, potentials, possibilities that you're then discussing with people. Of course, you're going to give them more information to clarify this. Again, let's look at this with a very simplistic example. You're sitting there in the team meeting, and in the referral report from the speech and language therapist, there is a long list of difficulties this child has in communicating, interacting, playing properly. Many red flags for autism. But also you're starting to hear that the child seems to have some significant difficulties with their learning. So automatically the hypothesis is generated that this child may have autism and learning disability. You don't have proof of this, it's not concluded yet, but it's certainly a hypothesis being generated. Now, let us also imagine here that this child is 3 years of age, and what is written in the report is that the primary care speech and language therapist has made specific reference to this child potentially having autism. So now you know that the parent who would have seen this report is aware that this is the reason for the referral. This should speak to you in a very different way than if you got to get a similar report, however, that was much more vague in its behaviors that are identified, suggesting that the child may have some difficulties with social communication, may have some difficulties with responding to the name, and some difficulties with their play and interacting with children in the preschool. And the speech and language therapist is simply inquiring, exploring the idea may or may there not be an autism present. It's not to confirm what the speech and language therapist is very confident is in place. That is, the child does have autism. It's, we wonder, and could you explore this? This should suggest to us that 2 different approaches are undertaken in how we are first interacting with the parents and the first tasks that we may actually engage with. This I might explore in greater detail in another section and in some of our discussion sessions. One of the things I want to emphasize about the assessment process, the process that begins from the first moment that you hear about the referral right through to the final feedback and the report being written, is that determining test scores is only a very small part of the process. Conducting a standardized developmental test or a standardized cognitive test, conducting an ADOS where you get an algorithm score at the end of it, or conducting a structured interview such as the DISCO or the ADAR, where again you get algorithms, administering an adaptive behavior questionnaire which we score up. All of these tasks, where there are scores at the end of it, form only a small part of our assessment process. It informs it. It's important that we do it. However, what is significantly more important is all the additional information, all that quality of information that we gather throughout everything that we do, that we then are able to synthesize in some way as we're going along. In other words, developing a good profile, a good understanding of who this child is, their strengths, their weaknesses, and their experiences of everyday events. What matters much, much more is that we actually have an appreciation of what's happening for this child, and therefore what will work with them. The assessment process is an engagement with learning more to inform us more so that we can better assist people, such as parents, preschools, schools. So again, understanding that an assessment is a process that begins much earlier than we may think. It's not just the assessment session of when a child is coming in. It's not just the interview. And it continues for significantly longer than we may think, continues right up until the report is sent out. That our assessment as a process is multi-element in nature. That is, we have a variety of interacting methodologies that we're going to use, including interviewing a parent, observing naturally a child, doing some direct assessment, using questionnaires. That each of these methods add, validate, and cross-check each other. So for example, you're sitting in a session there doing some free play observation. The child is there on the ground playing with the toys, and you're kneeling on the ground and you turn to the parent, and as you turn to them you notice that a child is playing in a particular way with a toy. This is something you have observed through natural observation, not direct assessment. Direct assessment refers much more to where you administer a task to a child to get their response, of which you're then scoring. We can think of that as more a standardized direct assessment, but this is more just observation of a child doing their free play. If we then turn to that parent and ask, does he normally do that at home? Is that the way he normally plays with it? Or is that typical of what he might do at home? And the parent says, yeah, that's the way he tends to play with it. We have now used two different methodologies. One is natural observation. Second, asking a parent a question. That allows us to cross-validate, allows us to add information to get a fuller picture of what's happening for a child, rather than only relying on what we may have observed in the clinic session. So the function of the assessment process by using these different methodologies is to be able to get as strong or confident as possible conclusions based on different methodologies. What we observe, what we get from direct assessment, what the parents tell us, and what's also checked out from what we see at preschool. Knowing, of course, that it's quite possible and even probable for many children that they will in fact perform quite differently in different settings. A child may well be able to do something in the preschool that they don't do at home, and vice versa. A child may well come into a clinic and do very well with this structured, scaffolded support of a clinician that they don't regularly do at home. And just as likely, a child may in fact come into a clinic and not perform, not do certain tasks, and not respond well to the testing situation, but a parent can verify that they're quite capable of doing that when they're relaxed and at home. So it's not just that we're using this information to validate what we found out from another methodology. Sometimes we're going to get conflicts of information that we then need to probe in further detail to clarify, to reconcile. Again, though I've said it before, I want to emphasize here that we should not place undue weight on the fact that what we observe in a clinic session or the information that we gather from direct standardized assessment is somehow more valid, more real, more likely to be true than that is reported by a parent or that we may see in a family home or is described by a preschool. Similarly, simply because a preschool or a school describe a child in a particular way doesn't make those observations more accurate or in fact more generalizable than what a parent is saying. For a particular example of this is that there's parents or teachers who will describe the child as functioning extremely well. They can sit in the classroom, they sit in the preschool, they engage, they seem to interact very well with the children, they're playing. But what a parent is then describing is a child that doesn't seem so able to do these. These are perfectly reconcilable. That a child in fact functions significantly better in much more scaffolded and structured settings where the rules are clear and where routines are much more predictable. This actually speaks to the child's vulnerability, that when they've provided high levels of scaffolding, they function well, but when that scaffolding is removed, they don't. So again, understanding the multi-element nature of assessment and understanding that the process is not just sequential, it's about having information being synthesized together in some way. What we're attempting to do is to provide a cohesive understanding or gather a cohesive understanding that we can then provide it to other people of what may be going on for this child. So in this way, we need to understand that an assessment as a process is in fact a series of decision points. We make decisions about what tasks we're going to do, in what order, for how long, with whom present. We even make decisions of how we're going to adapt or implement those tasks. We make simple decisions of how long a session will occur, how long they're spaced apart, and the reasons that they are done in this way. So from the very first moment that we hear of the referral, the first moment that we have read a report or a referral form, the first moment that we're person is being described to us, we should be making decisions. And that as we are going along, there will be a series of decision points of where we are determining the rest of the process or altering a process that we have already established, and that this is normal and that this is good. That if we are looking at the assessment process as a way of gathering information, or where we're using a multi-element approach to cross-validate, check, confirm, or disconfirm information gathered by one methodology, we need to understand that as we're going along and we're gathering more information, this should be then shaping how we conduct the next bits of the assessment. Now, in some services, the assessment process is rigid. It is prescribed. Step 1, social worker goes out and conducts the family functioning interview. Step 2, child comes in for a clinic session with 2 therapists. Step 3, a visit to the preschool. In between step 2 and 3, questionnaires are given to the parents, which they're filled in and then sent back. Even within rigid systems, even with rigid processes, it is still quite possible to recognize that there are decision points of how we can add to that process or alter it. So, for example, if a child comes into the clinic and simply does not engage, does not sit at the table, does not interact, in fact can even have major meltdowns, so very little is occurring during that clinic session, there should be an immediate adaptation to how we're going to gather this information. Similarly, if we do a clinic session and we get one understanding of a child, and we've sent a questionnaire out to a preschool that suggests quite a different child, then following that with a phone call would make sense. It would be logical that what we would want to do is to clarify with further questions around that questionnaire. But even in one session, we had a plan prior to the child coming in. As soon as the child emerges, comes into the room, and we see that this child is not who we thought they were. They seem to engage in a completely different way, seem more or less able than we had expected, or they're just having a bad day. Quickly adapting to what we're going to do in that session and the impacts that they may have on the process. So, for example, that we may not do the standardized test today, that we may in fact quickly do some free play, or that we may reschedule, or that we may use this session instead to talk to the parent, is an important part of the process. So there are continual decision points that we need to recognize and actively own as part of the assessment. It's normal and it is good. So simply put, if we understand the assessment as a process, we have a selection of tests, including questionnaires, interviews, and this is our toolkit. This is a sequence of steps which is going to be informed by the previous steps that have been conducted, or the information we get at the beginning when we're beginning the assessment or in the referral process. So what we want to do, even if we have prescribed the entire process from the beginning, is to articulate this explicitly. Here is our assessment. I even recommend that you quickly type this out, even if it is simply dot points. Step 1, family interview. Step 2, clinic session. Step 3, visit to the school. Step 4, questionnaires. But to note why, what is your rationale for that process? There are times where it makes perfect sense that the first thing you want to do is simply meet the child. You don't have much information about this child. You don't really have a good appreciation of them from what is in the referral information or the referral report. So it makes perfect sense that what you're going to do is simply do a free play session with this child, get an appreciation of who they are, so that when you're conducting an interview, when you then get the questionnaire information, you have a context. You have a real child in your mind that you have met, that you can place all of this information better on. That's your rationale. The rationale of conducting the session first is to meet the child, so that when you're gathering information through interview, through questionnaire, it gives you a more real context. But also to appreciate that you're doing this in a hypothesis testing methodology. That is, you have some initial hypothesis of who the child is, about their diagnosis, but also about why you're going to conduct the assessment in this particular way. And that as you're progressing, as you gather more information, this confirms or disconfirms certain hypotheses, or generates new ones, and therefore may shape, alter, or change your assessment process. So in summary, in this section we've been attempting to look at the assessment process, and in particular been focusing on the idea that a process is not simply articulating or prescribing a rigid process of here's step 1, step 2, step 3, this is the way we do assessments, but much more looking at it as a way of thinking, a mindset, an approach to how we do the work, which really involves generating hypotheses from the very beginning, gathering information as we're going along to either confirm, disconfirm those hypotheses or identify new ones, and looking at all the moments of where there are decision points, or looking at all the decision points in our process of where we add, remove, alter, or adapt our assessment so that we're better able to generate and synthesize those hypotheses into conclusions that are better able to answer the referral questions. In the remaining sections, or the next sections, we'll look in more concrete, specific detail how you might conduct the assessment tasks.